session. I just want to take a minute to talk a little bit about our reporting and give you a little bit more context for this event today. So it's about mental health services in New York City public schools. We've been reporting on this issue for a very long time, but to give you a sense of our most recent reporting, we did an investigation on what happens when, oh, that's not where it needs to be. Yeah, so we did an investigation on what happens when schools call the cops on kids in distress. Some of them are put in handcuffs. Some of them are under the age of, or around the age of 5 years old. And the person that did this investigation for us is Abigail Kramer. She's right here. She's going to be our moderator today. We did it in partnership with CHOPI and ProPublica. Amy's here also. They're also our partners on the event today. So that's some background. You can read it at thecity.nyc. But we didn't just do the investigation. We also like to inform New Yorkers. So the next thing we did, or the thing we did simultaneously, was an explainer on how to get mental health help in New York City public schools that's appropriate for your kids and for yourself. And we didn't just stop there. We also published a tool that helps you look up what kind of support might be available to you in your school. You can put the name of your school and the name of the school in the tool. It's every single NYC public school. And see, for example, how many times they might have called 911 on kids in the school, how many counselors per student, and how that compares on the city level and on the district level. So that's a little bit of what we do. You can check us out at www.thecity.nyc. But enough about us. We're here to hear from you all, and that's what the Open Newsroom is all about. Our reporting gets better when we listen to New Yorkers and what their concerns are, what their questions are, and when we take into account very often the tips that we receive from you all. So I want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you for sharing your stories, for listening, and for talking to us. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Amy, who's going to say a few words and introduce our wonderful panelists and moderators.
Thank you. My name is Amy Zimmer. I'm the Bureau Chief for CHOPI New York. And CHOPI is a nonprofit newsroom as well. We are dedicated to covering local education. I want to thank our partners, the city and ProPublica, and I want to thank the Brooklyn Public Library as well for hosting us. And just briefly, tonight's discussion on mental health resources in the public schools is a much needed conversation. And we hope to shed light on what's happening, or not, in schools from an array of perspectives: student, parent, advocates, community-based organizations working in the schools. And we have an impressive lineup of panelists. So to give some brief introductions, we have Nelson Marr on the end there. He is a senior staff attorney in the Education Law Unit at Bronx Legal Services. Kevin Dahill-Fuchel is the Executive Director of Counseling in Schools, which works with about 70 public schools across the city. We have Nicole Manning, who is a student at Manhattan Center for Science and Mathematics, and she's a journalist and the author of A Guide to Post-Pandemic Teen Mental Health that was published in the Yale Daily News. She will be going to Yale in the fall. And we have Rashida Brown-Harris. And Rashida is an amazing parent advocate. She has been working on healing-centered schools for a really long time, and has really understands how to navigate the system and what mental health supports are available or aren't, and the vision for schools that have more trauma-informed approaches. And now we have our co-moderators. As you heard, Abigail Kramer is here. She is an investigative reporter at the city. She has reported extensively on mental health and policing in New York City public schools. And we have Yan Zhu. She is the opinion editor at Brooklyn Tech at the newspaper there, and is co-moderating. And without further ado, here we go.
And then I have 2 mics for you all there that y'all can share. This one, electric chair, and then I'll have one for you.
Okay, just to start, we have a question for Nicole. You've researched and written about the impact of COVID pandemic on New York City students. Can you tell us just a bit more about your own experience and those of other students you reported?
Yeah, so it was really interesting. When I was given the chance to write this article, I was very much dealing with anxiety and isolation from the pandemic, and trying to navigate what that meant. And that was a very personal journey. It was very raw and uncomfortable, dealing with that with myself and what that meant with myself, and then trying to explain that to my parents as well. And then being able to speak with other students, I think a lot of what I heard was they felt unheard, and that their parents were kind of dismissing their struggles with mental health and what that meant. That their parents went through a lot of crazy things in their life, and that this was just one of the many hurdles that you have to go through in your life. So a lot of the students who I would talk to from various high schools around the city, they were just explaining how they didn't feel comfortable talking to their parents. And I specifically wrote this as schools were starting to go back to some form of hybrid mode, where students have the option to go both in person or stay home. And I think a lot of the students just wanted to emphasize more than anything, it's like, yes, it's great to be back and interacting with other students, but it's also important to realize that for this past year, we've been isolated and alone without teen interaction, without dealing with the daily struggles of being a teenager, and being in high school, and just structure and strictness of that. So it was very different dynamic, but what I just heard from a lot of these teens was that they weren't being listened to, and that they didn't feel like they had a space to be listened to from kind of what they've heard from their parents before the pandemic, when they tried to speak of these struggles, because these struggles with anxiety, depression, and suicidal thoughts were not new during the pandemic. They were very much a vast part of our society prior to the pandemic. But I think the pandemic just brought on various new and intensified stressors with parents losing their jobs, so students need to take on extra responsibilities on top of dealing with school and what that meant. So the fact that that was being very much disregarded and only being highlighted during the pandemic, I felt like a lot of students were very angry about that, because now that we're trying to figure out a space for themselves and me as well, and what that means coming back into a school setting, it feels like there's no structure. It's like we're starting fresh from the beginning, though this issue has been going on for so many years.
Kevin, I hope you'll forgive me because I'm going to totally go off script because I thought that was so interesting. And you've been in schools, your organization's been in schools since well before the pandemic. I'm wondering, what did you see that was different? Kind of, what's the before and after from your perspective?
I think your answer, is really profound, and there's a lot there to really let sink in terms of what the opportunities that are presented and are missed often in school. So there are some through lines. I think the before and after was just well described. I think that the connective tissue in that is what is the understanding and where are the spaces where young people are listened to and their voices are lifted up and really taken seriously and responded to? What are the subject areas that we can sort of take some of the drama out of and allow to be expressed and put on the table and met with? What in some cases, what are the physical spaces where that can happen? Not just, sometimes we think of spaces now these days, it kind of becomes a metaphor. But I think of it also practically. Like what space is made available for someone to be comfortable enough to kind of go to the places that you went in what you described. So I think I think the difference in the before and after that I would comment on is in the adults in the schools having some now in many respects, in many communities, many similar experiences where there was kind of a gap between the experience of students and the experience of the adults in the building. And I sort of think about this as like a trauma gap. And that gap is closed. And so the adults in a lot of the communities now are coming in, having experienced some things that may not be as well articulated as you just did, but they're experiencing in a similar way. And they have less availability to listen to the students because of what they're dealing with on their own. So the after right now for counseling in schools and for I think other organizations is how can we look at the parallel processes that are going on and pay more attention to sort of everyone in the school community from a mental health perspective. Students certainly, and it's real as that gets. But it intentionally needs to include the adults and their experience and allowing that to be part of it, because then I think that will empower more, right? Because I think when we get it, right, it's easier to pass it along. But I think we can learn the lessons from young people.
Thank you. Thank you for your response. Moving on, we just want to ask Rashida a question. We know that you've done a lot of work just involving projects and building healthy school cultures. Can you just tell us a bit more about your experience in creating healing-centered schools, and what role do parents play and what support do they need to play?
Okay. Building healthy school cultures is something that we all talk about, but folks don't quite know how to do it. And when I say folks, I mean, school administration and the DOE central staff higher up. Not as a diss to them, but just recognizing that they're good at what they do in regards to managing and operational, actions. But really getting to the root of the issue in regards to building community, and just us as a Healing Center Schools Working Group and our Parent Healing Ambassadors, knowing how important it is to bridge that gap and really work together as a community. And so when we talk about whole school change and we talk about our students and the youth, we think of ways that we can support them, but recognizing that supporting them first starts with ourselves, right? So the parents really need to be empowered and have some deep understanding of what trauma-informed and trauma responsiveness means, how it's happening in their schools, how they can support themselves in their households and support each other, peer-to-peer, the parents to parents. And that's what we do as a working group, as a Healing Center Schools Working Group. That's the work we do with our Parent Healing Ambassadors, is really supporting understanding what it looks like, what it means, what it should be with our youth, and working with our school staff. Building the community within the school community where we're just being as transparent as we can be, and just understanding that this work ain't easy. And it's not gonna happen overnight, but it's something that we have to really want and say it and mean it, but be vulnerable enough to trust one another with the work. So, and being honest enough to say, I know y'all said this is what you're doing with the students, but this is not what's happening with the students, because they're coming home and they're telling us. And supporting, creating an environment where the school staff, administration are listening and really wanting to find true solutions. And our Parent Healing Ambassadors, are learning more and getting bolder and courageous enough to continue to advocate, support themselves and support the school staff. And when I say support the school staff, we remind them that y'all are human, we're human, a lot of them are parents, we're all doing this together. So the whole school change that we need is really the community building, and it has to show up in our policies, it must show up in our budget. When we sit here and talk about programs, and we have to carve out real time for our school staff to feel safe and for our school staff to understand that this is a priority. And that's what we fight and advocate for when we're working, in our meetings, and making sure we continue to put it on the agenda and just really connect. And the parents are trying the best they can. Some parents are doing better than others in some schools. Obviously, it's because of the administration, different barriers folks face. You know, the Healing Center Schools Working Group created a community roadmap to building a step-by-step guide to build healing center schools, and we really do refer to that, and we try our best to support our school staff, our parents, and our students with that, forming the team, you know, creating the space to discuss and collectively, you know, engage with the school community to bring real healing center practices to their schools, less punitive, you know, measures, and yeah.
So I want to get back to that budget question that you raised in a few minutes. But first, will you just back up and just tell us what exactly are parent healing ambassadors?
So thank you for that question. Parent Healing Ambassadors is a role that grew from our work as the Healing Center Schools Working Group. And as I stated, you know, the community roadmap that we have, the DOE, the Department of Education, they're familiar with us. They're very familiar with us. We've been trying to really work with them or get them to, you know, make more healing center schools for the longest. So they are familiar with our roadmap. Well, during the pandemic, post-pandemic, everyone's talking about mental health awareness and mental health support. So they really did turn to us and say, you know, how can we start bringing this in? Recognizing that the regular ways weren't working, or the traditional course of action might not be the right action to take. And so they always knew that we focused on holistic, you know, measures and just more, holistic measures. So the Parent Healing Ambassador was a group from the Department of Education where they took parents, well, they didn't take parents, they surveyed their parents, and it was a call to action for parents to raise their hands and become these Parent Healing Ambassadors, where they receive training, lots of professional development, had meetings, you know, constant support sessions, and understanding, like I said before, what trauma-informed care is, what trauma responsiveness is, what it means when you say healing center, learning about self-care and then just mental health support overall. These parents wanted to do this, and the more they learned, the more they wanted, you know, to support themselves, their households, and their parents. So the Parent Healing Ambassadors were tasked with, you know, first and foremost, getting this training, understanding, and then taking it back to their school communities and really working with their parents and holding meetings, doing workshops, and just creating the spaces in their schools to continue the work with their fellow parents, including the school staff. So the Parent Healing Ambassador Program, it launched in 2021, and you know, over 800 parents citywide joined this initiative, movement, for lack of a better word. And it's because it was needed, but everyone, the folks who got involved just saw how much they can actually get done, and everyone recognized the need to just meet and discuss this collectively, and how much came out of it, but we start to recognize and realize, like, okay, you're just like me. Okay, well, you're going through this and I'm going through this, and so is my kid, right? And so you just build community first and foremost that way, and we're able, as a Healing Center Schools Working Group, able to connect with the Parent Healing Ambassadors to offer them continuous support and really try to advocate for more services in their schools, you know, through them and their advocacy.
Thank you. And Rashida, I think I called you Crystal, who was not able to be here tonight. I'm so sorry.
Crystal is our amazing Parent Healing Ambassador who could not be here, and I stepped in at the last moment.
And we are deeply grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
One of the things that you brought up was punitive approaches, and I want to take that over to Nelson. So here's why I love interviewing you so much and why I love you so much, right? Because you have done a lot of work on the side of working to build healing-centered schools and thinking about whole school cultures that really promote student well-being at multiple levels. But then you're also like on the ground representing kids, defending them against much more punitive approaches. And I'd love for you to kind of bridge the gap for us. Like, why is it important to work on both sides of that? What do punitive approaches look like? What do you see on the ground?
Sure. Just want to apologize beforehand. I'm recovering from a cold, so bear with me if I get into a coughing fit. Yeah, no, I've been, working in the Bronx for the better part of almost a quarter century. It's a little scary to think about that. My main role there is to represent students and families around education issues. And for the longest time, our office was one of the Legal Services NYC in the Bronx, was one of the few offices that provided representation to students in school disciplinary hearings. And that work brought us in contact with a lot of these punitive measures that Abigail and Rashida were mentioning. Students were being suspended, whether it was a short-term suspension for principal suspension or a long-term suspension, more than 6 school days, a superintendent suspension. And then we also saw students arrested, and worse yet, I think, in a lot of ways, students sent to the hospital emergency rooms by schools for being disruptive. And it's through that work, around these students who were displaying externalizing behaviors that were the most challenging for us. It was difficult to find good outcomes, and we tried our best through litigation. In 10 years ago, in 2013, we sued the city to stop the misuse of emergency medical services. There was an astronomical number of children being sent to hospital emergency rooms. Some of those hospital... I must be saying something right. And it was actually some of those doctors at the hospital emergency rooms who were saying, Nelson, something has to be done about this. They're sending us all these kids who really don't have a psychiatric or a psychological problem. They're just misbehaving, and the schools don't know how to manage them, so they're sending them to us. And so we did sue. We got a fairly significant settlement, but lo and behold, the numbers did not really change. And that was super frustrating, and it continued some of the frustrations that we experience, those of us in the education advocacy field, where we're trying to fight to improve outcomes for our clients and finding that there aren't really good solutions. And it was at that point that it really dawned on me that we're really trying to address the issue from the back end. We really need to do more at the front end, because suspensions, EMSing, this is all at the end of this whole process of trauma and adverse childhood experiences. Because coincidentally at that time, the research was really percolating around the impacts of trauma and adverse childhood experiences. It's stuff that was familiar to me because I also have a master's in social work. So it seemed like this was really the way to go, because if you look at the research, it is about building connectedness, that is a protective factor for children who've experienced trauma, for them to heal. And if we can actually promote that in our schools more, I think there would be more stronger connections between staff and students. It would benefit not only the students, but also the staff. I think if you talk to most educators, they will tell you that their biggest challenge is dealing with children who have externalizing behaviors, whether they're being off task, they're being aggressive, or they're being impulsive. Those things I think would be addressed. And maybe I'm getting ahead of some of the other questions, but I think that's why I've really come to this issue about building healing-centered schools, because it's not about being trauma-informed, because we have to understand that it's not about the worst moment in a person's life, it's about the fact that people can heal, can become resilient, and can actually reach their potential if given the right factors. So that's why we're talking about healing.
Thank you, Kevin. You've talked a lot about connectedness and just the role of educators and different members in the school community. And remarking in an earlier conversation, you said that clinical mental health professionals need to be just one part of this overall school culture that's like responsive to mental health needs. Can you just tell us a bit more about that? Why are the specialists important? What are the roles of other school staff?
Sure. So to sort of answer that, I think the first part that I want to say is that when you just, and if I could do like a quick survey in the room and say, well, what's the first thought that comes to your mind when someone says mental health, right? It probably is very different than if I said like you're going to have a phys ed class or we're going to go to the gym. You're not going to have that same experience. Like even in the conversation that we're having, like I'm not saying it's not appropriate, but we kind of lean towards the trauma, lean towards the problems. You know, I want to start by answering that by saying that the way I look at this and Counseling in Schools approaches this is that our mental and emotional well-being is just a central part of our life that needs to be cared for and nurtured by adults wherever we are. Schools are a place where two things are going to happen no matter what anybody does. If you take a group of people, if we were to be a group that came to this room every day for 6.5 hours, I promise you some social order would emerge and that would have some impact on our emotions. We may or may not leave this room with more information than we came in with, or different skills that we came in with, but I promise you those other two things would happen. And I would want us to get to a place where we hold ourselves and the schools accountable for how well people are learning or socializing together in a way that provides emotional well-being across the board. So if we start with that idea, that's where I say that everybody in the school building, any person that you interact with is going to impact you emotionally or have an impact on how you're doing. If you come in with adverse childhood experiences, otherwise known as ACEs in the research, right, then those interactions have that much more of an impact. You're that much more sort of susceptible to both the kindness and the goodness of a person and the sort of negligence perhaps or ignorance that a person might bring to you. So what I want to sort of start with is that every adult in a school building has a responsibility towards their own well-being, but also understanding the impact they have on the well-being of everyone. So that's where I want to move away from saying, well, once we've hired enough social workers, then we've covered the mental health in the schools. And look, I'm a clinical social worker myself. We place clinical social workers in schools. I believe there's a place for that. But it's not addressing the broader mental health problem that the communities are facing at large, the bigger systemic issues. Yes, there's a place. I think the training that I have, the training Nelson, I'm sure you had in your degrees, and would help when there are very complex situations and we need to sort of think about systematically, well, how do we set up systems in the schools to address certain things? My education and experience as a clinician would help and be useful in that. And there will be some individual students who will appropriately want to have that one-on-one conversation. There are, suicidality is real, right? Other kinds of depression is real. People need an opportunity to have someone to connect to, and school's a great place to do that. Our organization started by women who were recognizing in the clinic that they worked in, the children who were assigned to come to them didn't come. When they were in school, in their school-based work, they had access to the young people and they could do the work and see the results. So it's a great way of overcoming resource gaps in communities, but it doesn't address the broader mental health problem that I think this topic, in my mind, wants to address.
Thank you. So Nicole, there's this conversation happening about whole school approaches and multiple levels of support and school climates. I would love to hear from your perspective, so potentially based on your own experience, but also on the young people that you've talked to and the research that you've done. What's the most helpful? What are the most important kinds of supports that you can get from school, especially in the kind of moment where you discussed where people coming in with so much change?
I think the main thing that for me, and I think a lot of other kids that I've seen, is just we have guidance counselors, and we also have social workers as well. But for me, I've mainly just had my guidance counselor as an outlet, and for the fact that her door was open and she was willing to talk and speak with me. I did have service during that time, so having the guidance counselor's office always open
for me has been a really big shift in being able to transition from pandemic and all the stressors and worries that I've had coming back and integrating, but I think for other people as well, but also the teachers and bridging that gap, as you were saying, between teachers and students, and that we both like have a lot of traumatic experiences, a lot of changing experiences, and it doesn't need to just be traumatic. It just needs to be the fact that the life we had before the pandemic was not the life that we had after the pandemic, and who we were before the pandemic was not the same as we are after coming back to school and coming back to work and so forth. So teachers now understanding that difference, and when they're approaching students, when students are not doing their work, or when students are needing to come to talk to them, it's no longer as an excuse, but just feeling a space for an open conversation to happen. I think before I would have not had the confidence or felt the need to talk to my teachers if something's happening at home, or if I'm going through something, or if I need extra support or extra time. And I think my school did a really good job at the teachers just understanding that we're human. And a lot of the kids in my school, they were dealing with a loss of a parent, needing to pick up an extra job, needing to take care of their siblings. I'm editor-in-chief of my school's newspaper, and I've talked to a lot of students who are also running clubs in my school, and they're just saying we're dealing with struggles with engagement, and a big factor in that is just kids don't have the same time that they had before the pandemic. And I think that's important to acknowledge, and both inside and outside the classroom, and bridging that gap and making all school spaces more understanding, more open for change, because like I said before, we're all different people, and that's not a bad thing, but that's definitely an impact to who we are becoming and how we're interacting with various school resources and officials and teachers and so forth. So I think just having more room for open conversation in a way that there wasn't before. People were just kind of moving with their daily lives, and now we're just really taking a minute to step back, and it's like, okay, is this one thing, or is something really going on? And how can we support you in the best way? And I think just continuing that conversation of how can we support you has been the best thing I noticed, and I think that's just what all kids just want to hear, because it's a complicated thing. I think the anxiety, depression, suicidal thoughts, and just trying to grapple with this idea of what mental health means for you, and that's not a bad thing. That doesn't mean you have to have anxiety. That just means you're trying to figure out a more healthy way to deal with your everyday life. And having different spaces to lead with that open conversation, I think for many students as well, has been supportive.
Thank you. So I'm starting to think about this conversation like in three kind of parts, right? So there's like this question of school culture and climate. Can you talk to your teachers, right? If something's going on and you need more time or you need more support. There's the question of the punitive side of things, like are we suspending kids and or sending them to hospital emergency rooms rather than sort of addressing trauma or managing behavior appropriately. And then there's like the question of clinical services, and I'm going to lump in there like also educational services for students with disabilities that kids are entitled to. In my conversations with parents, I overwhelmingly hear that navigating that system of getting clinical services or getting educational services for kids with disabilities is just like climbing a mountain in hell a lot of the time, right? Like so hard to navigate, so hard to do. So I'd love to hear from panelists. I'm sort of thinking of you, Rashida, because I'm guessing this is something that you've heard from a lot of parents about, but across the board, this is something that multiple of you have a lot of expertise in, right? Like, what's happening with our system of special education services and clinical services that they're so hard to get?
It's coming.
It's not priority. We talked about it, but we don't prioritize it, and we, meaning not me, kind of sad, because a lot of our teachers and our school administration know how important it is, but they're so test-driven and laser-focused on, these grades and, and so we may have some services available, they won't create a system where it's accessible the way we need it, the way our students need it. But when it comes to our children with disabilities, it's every excuse in the book. So
I can jump in a little bit here, because like I said, one big part of our work is representing students with disabilities. And it has been for the longest time, students would get the services that were available, in the schools as opposed to what they really needed. So of course, if that is happening, then it's likely the child is not getting the services that they need to actually do better. Some of that is changing. There's always a lot of talk about trying to improve special education services in the DOE, but it's a huge bureaucracy and it's cost intensive. Which is again another reason why, because I see it from both ends, both the special education end and also from the punitive discipline end, that we need to address the front end. Because, guess what? Trauma and ACEs have impacts on learning. So, I truly think that that's also another factor here, that, because children are impacted by, a lot of the trauma and adverse experiences that they're seeing, it's affecting them in the learning processes as well. So that's why there's a greater need for services, especially in our low-income communities, and there's just not enough qualified individuals, partly to provide those services.
Great, thank you, Nelson. But before we open up to just questions from the audience, I want to ask, opening up to all the panelists, what are some examples of something that has worked, that currently does work in terms of resources with mental health support in schools?
Silence works. It's an important part. So one of the things that does work, I mentioned a little bit before, in some schools that we work in, where we've been able to actually modify some of the building physically and make the physical space that students have access to different, and not just students, but then also all the adults in the building different. So, schools were set up in a particular way to run a particular factory way of setting them up, right? And they weren't necessarily thinking about these things. So there are modifications and things you can do, and then having people there who know how to engage, ask the kind of question that you asked, Nicole, or be present in the way that you asked, that we be present to you, and have the kind of skills that come through Healing Center engagement, Process Flourish Agenda, and Dr. Sean Ginwright, if you haven't sort of looked in his work, please do. And also from a restorative lens and restorative practice in ways in which that we can learn to sort of connect with each other in a way that takes me away from my title or my experience and just puts me in the room as another person who can be present to another person, and we can engage in what's happening around. And I think when we've seen that, there are schools that we've worked in prior to the pandemic and some of the other challenges that came along, but that had, within the first quarter, one school I'm thinking in particular, within the first quarter, had 152 suspensions. And that's going from September to about December. And then through the experience of doing this practice in the next year, they had 3 in that same time period. And this was, I'm going to say, the 17-18 and the 18-19 school year. And I think that there was a dramatic impact in the city on the number of students we sent out on superintendent suspensions when restorative practices were coming involved. I'm not speaking to the issues around mental health, EMSing, but just those are things that work and that have worked. And I would say that I do think, and I think Nicole, you sort of illuminated some of this, I do think that there are more of the teachers and the staff who are beginning to approach the young people with that kind of, what is it that I can do to support you approach, and understanding that the pressures on them for grades and the laser focus that they're putting under, it has got to be secondary to that, because if they don't have that relationship, because the other thing that works in terms of mental health, and I think you alluded to this before, Nelson, was engagement, like connectivity. How do you know how to connect with another human being who is not having the same experience you're having? And maybe now we are having some similar experiences, but in terms of background and other things we're not. So how do you actually build a relationship there? And some of that is really happening. We want it to happen more and propagate through the ambassador programs and other things like that. But there is some of that, and I would say, I've been involved with counseling in schools since 1993, that there's a very big change overall in how, I would say, your average adult in the school responds to a young person when they see them.
I think I would add, certainly the department has engaged with more mental health and behavioral health services over the last 15 years, partly in response to a lot of the advocacy work that's being done. They definitely have increased the number of school-based mental health clinics. So there are actually mental health clinics in schools. Research shows that that's the best way to ensure children access mental health services, because then they don't have to find time after school to go to their mental health appointments. The city has also drastically increased the number of children's mobile crisis teams out there. So they do respond when there's a call put in about a child in crisis that may need same-day assessment about whether or not that child needs additional more intensive services like emergency room services. There is something that's coming in the pipeline, the mental health continuum, which we've definitely in support of. That hasn't totally rolled out yet. They're still building the infrastructure right now. That's going to provide direct access for children in 50 schools in New York City, mainly in the Bronx and in central Brooklyn, to direct outpatient services with New York City Health and Hospitals clinics for mental health services.
See, now we have to talk about the budget, right? So it's my understanding that while the mental health continuum and I think some of the other services that you mentioned are in plans that have been announced by the Adams administration and by the city council as well, there's no funding allocated for those programs in the proposed executive budget. Care to comment?
I can say that that's absolutely correct. It's not in the executive budget, the funding for the mental health continuum. That was true also the prior 2 fiscal years, but eventually it was put into the budget that was eventually passed by the city council. So there is hope, fingers crossed, that that's going to happen again for this fiscal year coming up.
I guess as a layperson, it seems surprising to put it in a plan announced by the administration and then not fund it in the mayor's proposed budget, but what do I know?